Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media, plus Cunningham's hardware store. I'm recording this from sunny and tropical New Haven, Connecticut. I did a panel here yesterday at Yale. I used to like to make jokes about speaking at all the schools that rejected me, but I didn't even try to apply to this place. So suck it, Yale. But no, everyone's been very, very nice to me. And it was totally worth the 6-hour train ride next to a slovenly teenager who didn't know he could put his luggage in the overhead compartment and seemed to have the hantavirus or something like that. But that doesn't seem to matter. If I start bleeding from my ears, I won't be bitter. Today we have, by far and away now, the most frequent go-to guest on this podcast. He is the what's the hockey dude's name? Ovechkin. Ovechkin. My brain's just not working. It's going to be one of those podcasts. He's the Gretzky of the Remnant.
Yeah, better.
There we go. But Gretzky's not number one anymore. But he's number one in our hearts.
Ovechkin, and I know that I say this as a Pittsburgh Penguins fan, and I understand, I acknowledge my bias. It's not even implicit, it's explicit. But I disapprove of Putin enthusiast Ovechkin, who, if you look at his number of assists, if you look at the number of points that he helped other people score, you see what his career was. They parked him in front of the goal, and everybody fed him. He'll never catch Gretzky on points. He'll never be in that tier. And now I'll really incur the wrath of the Washington Capitals fans, and I'll say he'll never even be Mario Lemieux.
But will he beat his wife like Potvin? All right, so
well, okay. This is what I like about being friends with you and working with you is wherever I think I'm going to take the heat, you take it. You go one more. You do one more.
I am not a big hockey guy, but I've been to my share of games in high school, and I've been part of those, or I've been around those chants of beat your wife, Potvin. All right, so anyway, good times, memories. Before we get to the really important stuff, let's get to the really, really important stuff. Moments before we started recording, I went on the Twitters and I said, about to record a podcast with Chris Stirewalt. Send me your obscure topic requests in the next 6 minutes, and they might get asked, quote unquote, on air. And so we have to give some credit to the first person to respond, since they're not a crazy anti-Semitic bot or anything. Shoshana Weissman, our friend,
she was the first.
Oddly enough, she responded in seconds, and she asked us to talk about marmots. I don't know if you have any opinions about marmots.
I mean, I think of marmots and groundhogs. I don't know. I think of marmots as the broader category. I guess there are specific things that are just marmots. I'm more groundhog conversant and adjacent, and I can tell you that I definitely did grow up in a home where there was a rifle in the kitchen by the back door for groundhog remediation, because though adorable and great, they are problematic because they will get in your culverts, they will block up pipes, they are nuisance animals.
We're going to turn to that in a second, but because you had to repair your internet connectivity, I had a second to do some exploration on marmots.
Okay.
And among the things I learned, first of all, they're living the good life. They hibernate over 200 days a year.
That's fantastic.
I'd pay real money for that. 2, in Canada, they're called whistle pigs, which is illuminating.
Yeah.
And there is some controversy about how the fact that Herodotus seems to have mistranslated the word for mountain ant into mistranslated the term for marmot into mountain ant, and wrote of how there were gold burrowing ants in parts of Asia, when in fact he was referring to marmots. And then, in my very limited time of research, I've learned that maybe in fact marmots do not burrow for gold, though some have been found to have gold flake in their fur because they're burrowing in gold when they're burrowing in gold-rich soil.
If you've got how many million marmots on how many million typewriters does it take to produce the Comstock load?
Right, and then once you find one marmot with gold in his fur, you are going to make a whole bunch of assumptions about causation and correlation that can lead you astray. So
you're going to get right in on that.
So anyway, you brought up your groundhog rifle, which brings me to something that I cannot really answer, but maybe you can. Therese of Arc asks, can you settle a family argument? Easter meats, ham or steak?
Well, we're actually
or groundhog, but I'm assuming
in our blending family, we're having that discussion right now. Lamb is the traditional choice, but and a delicious leg of lamb is totally delicious, but not everyone likes it, and it is of course trickier to cook. Right, lamb is a more demanding meat to roast, but it can be very, very good.
Of farm animals,
right? It's the fat cooks off too quickly, and you've got to be good at it, or you're going to end up with something chewy and gamey. We are going to retreat to the safest of all of the delicious roast meat choices, and we're going to have a standing rib. And here's why. It would be wrong if I said that I was marrying Jessica only because she has a rotisserie cooker, a large scale, looks like it came out of a restaurant with lava rocks on the walls. Looks like it was something that would be wheeled into the middle of a dining room with low back black leather chairs. But it's a factor when you factor in what's on the plus side of this blessed union. This rotisserie is in there, and I will be putting one thing I can safely say, I will be criticized for how large of a piece of meat that I get, because as we blend the families, we find my definition of a normal amount of roast meat is not in compliance with a normal human expectation for roast meat.
Fair. I will say on the lamb question, which is the burning question, part of the issue is, and this is controversial in some quarters, but I stand by it. Most of the lamb you can find in supermarkets is from Australia. And I don't know how it tastes in Australia, but by the time it gets across the Pacific Ocean in a deep freezer thing and maybe gets partially thawed and then refrozen and causes ice crystals in it, whatever. Like my wife will not order no matter how good the restaurant is, lamb unless it's domestic. And I think you can taste the difference.
Not unreasonable, but I will say in defense of Australian lamb and New Zealand lamb, like pork has, depending on how it's cut and depending on whether or not how close to an artery, how close to a cluster of funk. So if you get it perfectly butchered, it's like if you've ever had venison, how you butcher the deer has a lot to do with how mild the taste is. And you can tell when you get it with pork and with lamb, when it's in the vacuum sealed thing, when you open it up and you take a whiff, if you've got the wrong, if the butchery did not go well, you're going to get a funky experience.
All right. So last one, and I have to admit, I had to look up the reference because I was concerned that it was the inner Beavis in me was misunderstanding.
Your Beavis is pretty close to the surface, to be fair, sir.
It is. It's crying out. But I feel I should ask this because it is in fact from your Jessica's boss, Kent Lassman.
Yeah, Kent Lassman gets right to the front of the queue.
And you'll see why my inner Beavis was briefly confused. What lessons from the gay place can we apply to contemporary machinations of vanity and stupidity in Washington?
I'm looking up what year the gay place was published.
I already did.
It's one of my what year was it published?
The first of the three novellas was 61.
Perf. So Billy Lee Brammer I think All the King's Men is the greatest of the. There's a Beethoven effect that it was so good and so different that it's hard to appreciate how good it is because it spawned so much imitation. But The Gay Place by Billy Lee Bramer is basically the story of Texas political corruption in the 1950s, a world in which, and it's all fictionalized. And Billy Lee Bramer, a journalist, was writing what he knew. But it's a world in which Sam Rayburn is the king of the universe and Lyndon Johnson is ascendant, and the corruption and the self-dealing and all of that stuff. And The Gay Place was a hotel, I believe, in San Antonio, not Austin, but probably it's obviously time for me to read it again. But it's the story of what happens, and the lesson of The Gay Place is the same as what Warren Harding said when Warren Harding was leaving for the trip out west that was supposed to restore his reputation, but ended up killing him, which kind of restored his reputation. He said, "My enemies," I'm paraphrasing, "my enemies I can handle, but it's my damn friends that are the problem. And in politics, your friends are the problem. Your enemies, your opponents, you can deal with your opponents. You can see them coming and you can deal with it. But your friends and all of the people who are the remora swimming underneath you and around you with all of their own agendas and all of their own things that they're doing, that's where the big corruption comes in. That's where the bad stuff happens. And politicians who are too friendly with their friends, when we think about successful politicians, who was really good, especially at the presidency, who was really good, they didn't have big coteries of people, right? They didn't have their herd. If you look at Barack Obama, he was a successful politician. He had his bros, and they got him in some trouble, but he was a fairly solitary cat. And kept to himself. Reagan certainly had California
Reagan was
guys.
the most famous one, right? I mean, like, people always said that Laxalt was his closest friend, and then people talked to Laxalt about it, and he says, "Yeah, I mean, I like the guy, and we're friendly, but I wouldn't say we're close. He's a close confidant or anything like that,
Right?
Like, it was basically Nancy.
His wife was his close friend." And you could say the same about Cal Coolidge. You could say the same thing about Dwight Eisenhower. You could say it about Harry Truman. When you look at how people get in trouble, they get in trouble because they have these coteries of hangers-on. They have these people around them because not only do they do ill, they encourage you to do ill because they create too thick of a membrane around you. It's the Magnum PI phenomenon. Tom Selleck's career. I know that this is probably the fifth time I've mentioned this on the podcast, but Tom Selleck's career is taking off. He's getting successful, and he's faced with a choice. You have to stop doing Magnum PI so that you can start making 3 movies a year, so that you can really be a box office god. And he chooses not to do it and limit his movie roles because he knows that if he leaves, what's going to happen? All of his gang, they'll all lose this sweet gig of shooting a TV show in Hawaii for 20 weeks a year. And so he stays, and it affects his career, his chances negatively. And that happens a lot in politics too. So the lesson of The Gay Place is about Magnum PI, Ken Lessman.
So it's weird that you've never brought this book before, or these books before, because it's like a bingo card point on here to talk about how the most corrupting thing in life isn't money, it's friendship.
Yes.
Right. And I always tell the story about my dad, who said that, if someone called him up out of the blue and said, if you give my kid a job, I'll give you $10,000. My dad's like, get the hell out of here. But if his oldest friend called him up and said, hey, my kid's had a rough time, is there any way you can help me out and give him a job? My dad was like, I'd probably still say no. Maybe I wouldn't. I don't know. But it'd be hard, right? Because you do things for friends, and we're wired to do things for friends in ways that we're not for other people. And that is such a huge part of of politics generally, but of the problems that we're sort of seeing unfold with Trump, where I can't remember who it's it was, I think either Portuguese or South American guy, but this phrase that everyone uses now, I use it too. For my friends, everything; for my enemies, the law.
Yep.
That attitude is really becoming the defining ethos in a lot of ways of this administration, right? I mean, that is.
J.D. Vance was explaining why you can't have due process. And you can't have due process, he said, on the internet. He said that because Joe Biden ruined everything,
right
now we can't afford to have due process. We have to deport so many people that we can't follow the rules. We can't afford the niceties of due process anymore. And he said anybody who's in favor of due process is against dealing with illegal immigration. And I thought about all of the arbitrary, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists kind of language that we see in our politics. And this, I have to keep reminding myself, we're like 90 days into the Trump administration. When they talk about, we're going to have the tariffs, we're going to make a decision on the reciprocal tariffs in 90 days. We're going to pause the tariffs for 90 days. When he said that, it was like day 87 of the Trump administration. And I have to remind people, as the song says, we've only just begun. We've only just begun. The idea that we have any stable, predictable idea about what the conditions will be 3 more months from now is crazy. I think for now, it is politically functional to do your own whataboutism if you're in this administration. We have to do this because Joe Biden was so bad. And if you don't agree with us, then you're saying Joe Biden was right. And I think as a self-talk and in-group way of being, I think that it's serviceable to keep the folks who are already with you. But man, I gotta tell you, that shtick that's gonna get real old, real fast.
Yeah, I mean, it is, and I say this with love and respect for Andy McCarthy and Ed Whalen, two former colleagues of mine. I'm a contributing editor still at National Review, so they're still colleagues of mine. But I'm a big admirer of both of them. But they're conservatives, and they're
you mean terrorist enthusiast, pro-terrorist Andy McCarthy?
That's right. Soft on terrorism, Andy is how he was known.
That's the guy. That's his rep.
But they're increasingly appalled, and the idea that there is a serviceable conservative constitutionalist argument available to you in defense of what Trump is doing, when Ed Whelan and Andy McCarthy are appalled. I mean, forget our own Sarah Isgur, forget anybody else. It's just like, if there was a intellectually defensible way to sort of say you can do all, and actually Andy has spelled out all sorts of intellectually defensible ways you could deport these people. It's just the Trump administration has decided not to do them and instead doing this goat rodeo or whatever you would call it. So,
well, think about, if I may, about the idea that when you're having a discussion, when there is a discussion about whether or not we are in a constitutional crisis or not, right? The Supreme Court plays, they give the president an off-ramp. They say, you need to facilitate. You gotta act right here. Act right. We're not going to tell you to do it, but so we're going to be deferential to you, and then you can be deferential to us, and we can all step back from this. So while that conversation is taking place, the president brings the guy who is the authoritarian in question to the Oval Office and says, do you want to send him back? No, I don't want to send him back. Okay, well, what can I do? LOLZ, laughs at rubs it in the court's face. And then, just to make sure that we get as close to rupture as possible, he then says, also, we're going to start sending U.S. citizens to foreign countries. As if we don't have the prison space, right? As if we don't have the facilities in the United States to house the worst people ever. We've got them. We've got supermax penitentiaries. We've got room. And by the way, why are we outsourcing jobs for prison work to foreign countries? I thought we were supposed to be bringing the jobs home. Aren't we supposed to be bringing the jobs home?
And actually,
But
prisons are the source of really pretty good middle-class jobs.
totally.
In the United States.
Especially if you're in a state like California or elsewhere where they have strong unions and they have it's kind of the ideal. It's a Vancian ideal kind of job. To then talk about doing something that is so after a couple weeks of the administration and their supporters saying, we're not talking about citizens. These people aren't citizens. They don't have the rights of U.S. citizens. It's not that. And then Trump says, and maybe citizens too. So I wrote about in a Dispatch piece at the beginning of the month about the conveyor belt. It's the Greenland conveyor belt. It's a joke and a troll. It's actually pointing to a larger, more serious problem. No, actually, we're deadly serious, and we 100% mean exactly what we say. And that's when they tell you, well, he ran on this. He told you he was doing it, so don't be surprised when promises made. So I guess that's the iteration. I'm trolling you, seriously, but not literally, and then concludes with promises made, promises kept.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, you and I are nurturers of ideas or opinions, conclusions, accurate assessments of reality that run against the grain of conventional wisdom, a whole bunch of things. Parties are too weak. Congress is broken. I mean, everyone now agrees with Congress is broken, but we were saying it when people looked at us funny. The whole idea of co-equal branches is a myth. And one that I've been banging my spoon in my high chair about for the last year or so, which I think is really, really, really hard to convince people, in part because politicians in their bones think it's true. And so do the supporters of those politicians, but is the whole idea of a mandate. There's a soft version of it. There's a weak version of it that I can credit, which is sort of like, yes, if you ran on something as your main thing, you should be expected to try and do it.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that bothers me about it is that people think if you won the election running on something, that you get to do it, which is different.
Right.
You get to try to do it politically, right. But like the election on Donald Trump wasn't a referendum on a global trade war or annexing Greenland or any of that kind of stuff. It was a referendum, to the extent it was a referendum at all, about which one of these two people has a mandate to be president. That's it. And then once in office, they have to negotiate with the other branches of government. They have to make a case to the American people. They have to find the money to pay for things and all that kind of stuff. They don't just get to do something because they were elected and that imbues them with some sort of magical authority to do it. It just gives them the political opportunity to try to do what they ran on, but they still have to deal with all these other politicians who got elected with their own mandates to have those positions.
The Democrats tried very hard to make 2024 a choice election. You have a choice. There are two paths, and which one will America choose? But they couldn't quite get there. They ended up with a referendum election, and it was not a referendum on Donald Trump. It was a referendum on the party in power.
Right.
And the party in power lost because people were broadly dissatisfied. When you look at how people moved, I'm fascinated with Jared Polis and Colorado. The only state that didn't move, so the movement was pretty uniform across the country. It was obviously smaller in swing states because the Democrats were focusing their energies there. And so the shift was 4 points in the swing states as opposed to, 8 points nationally or whatever. The only state that bucked the trend was Colorado. And one could argue that, yes, Colorado probably continues to get more Democratic, but also because Jared Polis and the Democrats in Colorado, John Hickenlooper too, figured out a way to be a different brand. They got out from under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and they have their own very Coloradan kind of, it's like, you know what? they were abundance progressives before abundance progressivism was chic. He's got some libertarian stuff. He's doing all this stuff. When I look at Colorado, I see further reinforcement that the problem was Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the status quo. It wasn't, and when we think about, I don't know whether you saw any of the signs, as I traveled the country and I was in, I made it to Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, Pennsylvania multiple times, Michigan, and Wisconsin, all during the election season. And in every state, I saw the signs. And the sign said, Kamala Harris, higher prices, Donald Trump, lower prices. Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
And it was like they were lined out on the streets. More illegal immigration. I forget what the phrasing was, but it was like a barber shave that they set them up in these little 4-sign rows along busy thoroughfares. And it was clear Donald Trump is going to fix the immigration problem, and he's going to deal with inflation. And they kept it simple. And I've told you this before, but it bears repeating. I was wrong about the 2024 election in one very important way. It was a fundamentals election. At AEI for an election watch event, Bill McInturf, who is my favorite Republican pollster, he's from Public Opinion Strategies, which is the Rolls Royce of Republican pollster firms. And he did the Wall Street Journal poll forever. And now he does the NBC News poll. And we were having this discussion about the vibes and Harris and Trump and da-da-da-da-da. And he said, and this was before the shift in the electorate had occurred in October, he said, this is a fundamentals election. This is just a fundamentals election. The president of the party in power has bad approval ratings. People are dissatisfied with the economy. All of the dashboard indicators say that the party in power is going to lose. And that's what's going to happen. And he was right. It was not a vibes election. It was a fundamentals election. And while Donald Trump was going around being crazy with Elon Musk and doing whatever, the Trump campaign, Chris LaCivita, Susie Wiles, and the people who were running the Trump campaign ran a really, really, really solid fundamentals campaign that you could have attached to almost any Republican candidate, right? And that, I think that's what we missed, but it speaks to, that's what I missed. What it speaks to is what the mandate was. And Donald Trump's mandate was to address the problems that the persuadable third of the electorate found with the current governance. And it didn't have anything to do with these people who are like, the real problem is that women are working. And the real problem is that people are too rich. And we need to be poorer so that we will be happier. And I don't recall any signs on the road that said virtuous poverty with Donald Trump. That was not the vibe.
And the decadent crapulence, vote Trump, was not a big thing out there. Yeah, I agree with that. I have a meta question and a basic question. I'll start with the basic question. Our colleague Rui Teixeira, who is increasingly like the dude from Twilight Zone running around yelling it's a cookbook about some of this stuff. He reminds me so much of my old boss, Ben Wattenberg, who was going through the same thing in the 70s and 80s, screaming at Democrats, get your act together. But he identifies 3 different strategies so far Democrats have come up with. I wrote my LA Times column about this and added a 4th, which I thought was a little strange that he left out, because he obviously knows this. And maybe it was just a timing thing. But anyway, Roy's wonderful. But he says there have been basically 3 Democratic approaches to Trump. One is just replay resistance from the first term.
Mm-hmm.
2, and closely related, and he calls it a close cousin, is fight the oligarchy tour,
Mm-hmm.
with Bernie and AOC, which really is just resistance plus a little raw class warfare BS in it. The third is the abundance Dem stuff, which I think is the most has the most intellectual heft to it, is the most interesting, is also the most problematic for a bunch of different reasons, starting with if you took abundance Democrat stuff seriously, and I think there are a lot of, I recommend to people, it might have been too harsh, but it was clarifying. Kevin Williamson's review of the abundance book was
he took the paint off him. He took the paint right off him.
He did. It was sort of tough but fair. But the fights that these guys would have to wage would all be basically with Democratic constituencies.
Right.
If you want to get rid of or bypass the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Water Act or any of that kind of stuff, you're not picking fights with Republicans. You're picking fights with seriously entrenched Democratic constituencies, and that's hard. And then secondly, barring some really bold governor who could do that at the state, that stuff at the state level, Democrats have no power. So all they have, their argument would boil down to, we want to do these things and you have to trust us this time that we would do them. And that's not a great argument when you're out of power. And the Democratic Party is more distrusted now than it has been literally in the history of polling, it seems like. But then there's the fourth one, which is the James Carville play dead thing, which is just basically, is it Sun Tzu originally who says, when your enemy is destroying himself, don't get in the way? You know,
right.
It's everyone.
And Napoleon had a version. Yeah.
Napoleon had a version of it. I think Gilligan from Gilligan's Island had a version of it, but it was very strange.
But it was really targeted at the professor. It felt more like a personal grievance.
It was. And it was really about making a move on. Anyway, we don't have to get into my Marianne fantasy. I have a whole substack of alternative fan fiction about all that.
After you're canceled, you can just go ahead and switch that one to public.
And the play dead one just basically is that. It's just Trump is immolating. He's screwing things up. It's fine to point it out every now and then and say, you know, and Carville just yesterday or 2 days ago had a follow-up op-ed on this saying, it's not about Wall Street, it's about your 401k, you know, and point these things out. But other than that, just don't make yourselves the issue.
Right.
It seems to me that that's the smartest of the four, or the wisest of the four, at least. It's the one that leads to the best outcomes for Democrats in the short term. So that's the basic question. Do you agree with that schema of those four? Is there a fifth? Is there a fifth kind of heat that we're all missing?
The fifth heat from the fun cooker.
And what do you think, basically, with that setup, with that framework, what do you think the Democrats should do?
Well, I think there are two things that have to happen at the same time. So James Carville is right in the sense that since Democrats don't have any means to control the outcome of the conduct of the federal government, right? They don't have any direct political means. They can be parties to lawsuits. And by the way, I asked on Sunday, a Democratic congressman, I played him some clips of the way that Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries used to talk about the courts. Yeah. Juxtaposed to now the reverence for the courts. And that I'm pro hypocrisy. The Rochefoucauld line that I quote all the time, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. Mm. So welcome aboard the pro separation of powers, previous court packers. So they can support the courts or file amicus briefs or do whatever. But James Carville is functionally right that there's nothing that they can do, at least until after midterms. There's just not there. They don't have the means. Now they could make themselves the story, right? You could go chain yourself to the Department of Education and stage a sit-in or something, I guess. But there's really not much they can do. The other three things are questions about what they're going to do when they get there. So what are you going to do for the persuadable third, for the governing third? Doesn't matter what you do because they're not looking at you anyway. They're certainly looking at Trump now. Donald Trump has demanded that they continue to pay attention to him. But the governing third, the persuadable voter, low partisan affiliation, slightly lower propensity, these voters are not tuned in to the abundance Democrat versus bold what did Elizabeth Warren used to say? Big structural change.
Mm-hmm.
They're not dialed in on that debate, but it is an important debate for Democrats to have, because I'm watching a Democratic Party right now where the smart people say you got to get to the middle, right? Gavin Newsom, who's like, I don't know who's doing all this Latinx, trans women, and sports stuff. And it's like, it was you. You did it.
He might as well be in a giant hot dog outfit,
Right.
saying we're going to get to the bottom of who crashed this hot dog cart. You know?
Exactly. So he's doing that. You've seen John Fetterman, who I think is don't sleep on John Fetterman as the Democrats' 28 candidate. You saw Gretchen Whitmer. Gretchen Whitmer finally, I no longer have to keep explaining to people why Gretchen Whitmer is was such an overrated political talent. When Democrats were like, well, why don't we draft Whitmer? I'm like, you need to go look at Gretchen Whitmer. Be very sure about this. You can see Shapiro in Pennsylvania staking out, and just take the tariff question. On tariffs, Shapiro was like, I know what to do. Punch Donald Trump in the face. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to punch Donald Trump in the face. Whereas Whitmer was like, well, see, now tariffs can be good. And they have different the United Auto Workers are such a power in Michigan that she's not free to get freaky. But
the steel unions are in PA, and Shapiro's better.
Insofar as the United Mine Workers and the United Steel Workers still have a presence in Pennsylvania, the knowledge workers of suburban Philadelphia and the knowledge workers of suburban Pittsburgh are large enough in number that Shapiro is, and it's better politics. How do I feel about tariffs? I think Donald Trump is ruining the economy compared to Whitmer, who's trying to have it sort of in between. So you have all these folks who are clustering up on the center left. They're trying to moderate because they're thinking about what happened to Kamala Harris. They're thinking about all the dumb things that Kamala Harris said to try to get to be the Democratic nominee in 2020 about sexual transition for illegal immigrant inmates, and defund the police is raising important questions. And she was ashamed of her history as a tough on crime prosecutor, and blah, 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 blah. All of the stuff that she did and Kristen Gillibrand did and Joe Biden did at the outset of the 2020 cycle for Democrats, they all thought Bernie was where the action was. So they all went over and hung out with him and got that lane all crowded up. Because they were trying to beat Elizabeth Warren in that space. And then, of course, that left the room. Once Amy Klobuchar started running better, that was the market signal for the Democrats. And Pete Buttigieg went over there, but Joe Biden definitely, who was more comfortable being center left, ran right back over there and took that space from poor old Amy Klobuchar. This time, what's happening? They're clustering in the center left. Shapiro, Paulus, Whitmer, Newsom, they're lining up. They're over there. They think they're going to avoid the Kamala Harris fate. Meantime, Bernie Sanders is staging the apotheosis of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Tens of thousands of people showing up at rallies, Ro Khanna, the elevation of Cortez. Now, it's real early to start being a messianic rise. It's very early. Messiahs get stale in politics pretty fast. But I suspect that what will happen among Democrats, and I'm sorry to always make everything horse race, but that's how I have to just think about things. What I see is it's going to get real crowded on the center left. Ocasio-Cortez will start to look like she's going to be the one to beat at some point. And then there'll be a lurch leftward by a bunch of these Democrats as they sort themselves out. Who wins? And it matters who wins, but it also matters how they win. And back to your mandate question. There's a world in which John Fetterman becomes the Democratic presidential nominee, and he wins in the current iteration of John Fetterman.
Mm-hmm.
And if he does, then he will have won as a moderate, Rust Belt state, friend of Israel kind of guy. But John Fetterman could change again right, and rediscover his Sandersite roots. And if he determines that that's the better place to be, and then he'll win as that version of him, and that would have implications for the general election, but certainly for whatever kind of presidential administration came out.
So I'm not sure I have the power to force you into the escape velocity of moving away from the horse race.
I'm ready.
Stuff.
I'm going to try.
But so, well, just let me just put it this way. I mean, we'll keep it in horse race stuff to a certain degree. It seems to me that the lesson of Donald Trump, the lesson of Barack Obama, the lesson of Bill Clinton, to a lesser extent, the lesson of George W. Bush,
for sure,
is as Samuel L. Jackson says of Wilbur the Pig, personality goes a long way, right? And it turns out that like the parties end up, because of the weak party stuff, which we don't need to revisit, the parties end up supporting the person in power and the person who gets the nomination, and they start convincing themselves that that's what they need to do, and they get over their cognitive dissonance and their hangups really quickly. And if Donald Trump does not prove that, I don't know what he proves, because like the GOP, I mean, if you just look at, I just mean this in political terms, I'm not talking about his soul or anything like that, but if you look at Mike Lee's transformation from a humble, sweet river hobbit to Golem in the 10 years of Trump, it's really kind of amazing, right? And I hear stories about how he treats his phone with his Twitter on it like it's his precious. And so it's more cautionary thing about Twitter poisoning, but it remains the case that, you know, politicians with personalities, strong personalities, and even very weak character bend the parties to their will. And so if there's just a guy who's popular who can win the presidency, that will transform the Democratic Party. And it doesn't matter where on the slide rule Ezra Klein ends up on his Abundance Democrat stuff.
That's exactly right, because it will be, and that's why I say it matters how they win.
Right.
It matters how they win. The Kurt Vonnegut line, we are what we pretend to be, so we should be careful about what we pretend to be. Mm-hmm. Whatever costume we put on to get the gig, right, affects how the people who follow us, you know, the Levinian point, we resolve cognitive dissonance in favor of our tribe. When we're faced with cognitive dissonance, that one leads us out of our tribe and one leads us deeper in, we resolve it in favor of our tribe, typically. And the progressives who came to love Bill Clinton for his moderating ways, they loved success, they loved their party, and they wanted more of it. All that you say is true. The question before Democrats now is what James Carville is putting in front of them is the very difficult question of, do you believe the things that you say, or are you afraid that it might actually work, that what Donald Trump's doing might actually work? Because if you believe the things that you're saying as a Democrat, Donald Trump's story will end in tears and disaster. If you're a Democrat or a conservative and you believe the things that you say about Donald Trump and believe the things that you say about policy, then the correct answer is to say, finally, King Midas has been granted his wish. He can finally do it, and he will die of it, right? Figuratively, that it will be his undoing, is that he will finally have whatever he wants, and it will be too much, and that there will be no one to push back, and there will be no one to tell him he's wrong. And, you know, watching that session in the Oval Office with this guy by the way, just as an aside, as a person who's obsessed with how men should or should not dress for their vocational work, we need a standard for what is acceptable to wear to the Oval Office.
Yes.
Is Kid Rock, that was good, apparently, in his USA duct tape suit. And then the guy who is the strongman from El Salvador, dressed like I don't know what that was. The black the all black, and I think he had sneakers on. But
Ben Dreyfuss had a great line. I'm going to butcher it, but the gist of it was this guy was dressed like a salesman at Zara in the Valley.
That's amazing because
who asked 19-year-old girls at the mall whether they model.
That's great because I was going to say it looks like a guy who works in a Maserati dealership. So it's the same. That's the guy's night job, and so we should set a uniform standard for what one considers to be appropriate in the Oval Office, if that is okay. But Volodymyr Zelensky is not okay. Anyway, the idea of all of these people sitting around in a circle affirming Donald Trump and repeating him and engaged in this sort of religious the religious ceremony of Trump affirmation, the one that Gretchen Whitmer had to hide her face in because she had so badly miscalculated how to play the situation. And you see that, and if you're a Democrat or a conservative, you're looking at that and you say, well, there's nothing to do to stop them now. They're going to have to stop themselves. The things that they're doing are going to have to fail, and then we'll pick up the pieces, right? So, my typology is that I say that there are progressives and liberals, conservatives and nationalists, populist left, populist right, who don't like the Constitution that much. They have problems with the gifts of, as a great author once wrote, the miracle of the Enlightenment. Conservatives want to conserve a specific version of it, the George Willian idea of a conservatism that conserves a revolution, the fruits of a revolution. And then you have liberals who want to conserve sort of the fruits of the Enlightenment broadly in terms of for the whole world. And those two groups of people, if they believe what they say, then they have to assume that Donald Trump will end up in the ditch, that it just because it doesn't work. There'll be a lot of damage along the way. On the progressive left, what do they say? I want those tools. I want that power, but I want it for my purposes, right? It's not about preserving the institutions. It's about getting control of the institutions and getting control of the power. When Democrats talk about the courts, respect for the courts, when they talk about what's wrong with the Humphrey's executor, if we're gonna take it deep, brother, let's go all the way to Humphrey's executor. And when Joe Biden got high on his own supply in March of 2021, he decided that the mandate that he had, which was to not be Donald Trump and act normal, was no longer operant, that now it was time for big transformational change and da-da-da-da-da. And he wanted to expand the power of the executive and do all that stuff and fundamentally change the way that America worked. People don't want that. They don't want it from the left and they don't want it from the right. And if you're a liberal or a conservative, you have to imagine that this won't work.
Yeah, I mean, I've been given that talk, a version of that talk to conservatives and libertarians forever. Like, if you actually, it's a weird thing. If you think Hayek is right, just broadly based that he's right, about how free markets work, about how government planning works, all these kinds of things. If you think Tom Sowell's right, if you think Milton Friedman's right, if you think these guys are right, then the people who do the opposite will, in the fullness of time, be proven wrong. So stop thinking in terms of election cycles about your fundamental ideas about how the world works. And if you think you're wrong about that stuff, fine, then go find some ideas that you think are right. But you can't have it both ways. I have, well, I don't want to get on to it. Once I start talking about the people I have contempt for, Katie bar the door will be here for a while. So I will check myself before I wreck myself. I want to get back to this. The meta question I wanted to ask you, it's really two meta questions, is, okay, put the horse race stuff aside. I couldn't
I'm
really
suppressing.
I couldn't pry you away. it feels to me, and I concede this is more vibe than anything else. I think it's well-informed vibe, right? I like to joke about how Scott Lincecum one day was going for a walk and he sees in some ivy on the ground a monkey's paw. He picks it up and he says, I wish people cared more about trade and cared more about these arguments.
We need to have a conversation about trade.
Yeah, and then the bony finger bends on the monkey paw and he gets his wish, and you stupid F, look at you now, right?
Yeah.
I have a similar tangential monkey paw type theory about the left and intersectionality stuff, where the left insisted that mere class-based politics and analysis, the sort of vulgar Marxist class war stuff, was insufficient. And you needed basically what is essentially, I mean, they won't say it in these ways, but it's a culture war argument. The idea that we should privilege the plight of certain groups, women, Black people, immigrants, non-traditional sexual orientation types, as well as class, and this intersectional matrices of blah, 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 right? All that kind of stuff. That's basically, it's a way of saying we need a left-wing culture war argument to adorn our class stuff. And they got their wish, and young Black men and Hispanics all joined the Republican Party, started voting Republican as a result of it. And we don't have to do the whole Latinx thing, but like, they wanted to change what the Democratic Party was about to something more than the sort of white working class FDR coalition thing. Just working class thing, right?
Or just a working class party.
So they chased away they chased away the white working class, and now they're starting to chase away the Black and Hispanic working class, because by making politics more culture war, and people say, "Oh, the Republicans did it." There are cases where the right is to blame for the culture war stuff in all sorts of ways. But if you do this as a history of the last 30 years, it's the federal government going in and imposing, sometimes correctly, certainly with the civil rights stuff, but imposing a cultural view on things that elicits a response from the right that creates the culture war frictions. Anyway, we can argue about the history of all that. The only bit I want to get to, and then I'll let you run free, is it seems to me that because of those strategic and unthinking decisions by the Democrats and the left, they no longer have a theory of the case that they can bring to politics, right? I mean, if you just look at the 2024 election results, Kamala Harris lost by 1.48%. That's the fifth narrowest margin since 1900. It's not a big deal if that's all you're describing. But then you look at the internals, you look at the direction of these coalition, of these demographic groups. You look at the unpopularity of the Democratic Party. Last week, Harry Enton was freaking out because for the first time since 1994, not only have the Democrats lost their decades-long double-digit lead in which party cares the most about you, but they're tied as of last week with Republicans on which party cares more about you, right? So I just don't know that they have the vocabulary to articulate a different metaphysic, a different sort of, here's the grand reason why God put Democrats on earth, because they've lost the plot on why Democrats exist in a certain way, and Donald Trump has been eating off their plate so much. What would you say is, at that sort of meta level, the theory of the case now, other than being an anti-Trump party?
I'm going to say two things. And the first one that I'm going to say, you're going to correctly say that it's kind of horse racy. And I acknowledge it. I acknowledge that it will be kind of horse racy. But the first thing is, do Democrats want their new coalition or not? They're losing their old coalition. They've lost their old coalition.
Right.
Do they want the new one? And the new one is the old Republican one, right? So Democrats could have the Eisenhower coalition. They could have big numbers with Black voters and non-white voters, and then all of the college-educated, affluent, suburbanite, upwardly mobile people. They could have it. but they'd have to do something sort of on par with what Lyndon Johnson did to the party in 1964 and say, we're going to have to kiss off a bunch of our base, right? The power of the Deep South and even Virginia and other places was so great in the Democratic Party that in 1948, it was a credible threat, right? When Truman integrates the army, it's on. And the battle which had been taking place for 30 years continues and intensifies. And it was not clear that the Democrats were ever going to be able to get out from under the South. And then Lyndon Johnson went big and he kissed them all off and he never got them back. Democrats never got him back. But he managed to get 90% of black voters, which gave them what they needed in the cities of the North. Lyndon Johnson was acting rationally based on, after the Great Migration, where were the black voters? They were packed into cities in the North that could flip typically Republican states if Democrats had high enough numbers with those voters. And it was the most astonishing, intentional, and abrupt change in coalition. Democrats would need something on par with that now to get the new coalition. And the way that you get the new coalition is that you say to the campus radical, the weirdo, the whatever, to the lunatic left, you know what? We're done. We're breaking up with you. And you start chasing those upwardly mobile, affluent, high propensity voters. You see, underappreciated in what's happened so far in the Trump administration, the Wisconsin Supreme Court election, where Elon Musk spent $25 million and went up there and they were going to do it all. The new Democratic coalition proved its worth. They showed up and said, no, we vote. You don't have to ask us to go vote because we vote. We vote in all these elections. So that's a model that the Democrats could pursue. It's middle, solidly middle and upper middle class. It's the top 3 quintiles, right? Is you're pushing into those folks. And that means you have to provide good schools for their kids. You have to care about public safety. You have to give them what they want. I don't know whether Democrats are able to do that. But the philosophical part, so that it's not just horse race, is this. You talk about the great relearning frequently, and the idea of we forget and then we remember. You can look at what happened with U.S. appetites for overseas intervention, Vietnam, 1975, post-1975, absolutely not. And then Reagan does Grenada and Bush does Panama, and then the ringing success of the first Iraq War. And people, not just Republicans, are like, you know what? I think we were too spooked by the Vietnam thing. I think we're too spooked about it, and now we know how to do it and we can do it. And then post-Iraq, people say what? We're never doing that again. We're never going to do that. We're over that. We're not going to do it. There's a similar sine wave on the government trying to change the way people live. After the fall of the Soviet Union, a broad consensus was born in the United States, which was, well, here's one thing we know. That didn't work. You can't change human nature. You got to let people live, baby. You just got to let people live. And you saw it in the anti-PC backlash that took place in the United States in the 1990s, right? The Clinton era, do what you feel, brother. And the highly individualistic, selfish, but highly individualistic energy around politics took hold and flourished. Well, a generation after that, people on the left said, it's time to change human nature again. We've got to get back in the changing human nature business. And we're going to have speech codes, and it wasn't just the federal government. It was potent institutions all the way down the stack, through higher education, through public schools, through all sorts of institutions. When the NFL put a sign, put a marker in the back of their end zones that said end racism, you're like, you know, I was going to join the Klan, but I was watching the Steelers game and I saw that sign in the end zone at the NFL, and I decided I'm not going to become a virulent racist as a result of what I saw. People talk about the virtue signaling and all of that, but it was a project on the left to change people. And instead of the right saying, we're not doing that, we're going back to the old way. We're going back to the old way. People are going to do whatever they're going to do, and you can't change human nature, and you can't beat it. The right has said, we are going to change human nature. We're going to change how people work. We're going to change how people live. We're going to change what their family structures are like. We're going to change everything about the way America works and people work and what people are like. When I hear people talk about that the purpose of tariffs is to restore masculinity, when I hear people talk about that the purpose of these things is so that more women will stay at home from work and will focus on raising their children, I think, oh, you're high. You're just on drugs. Women entered full participation in the American workforce in about 1982. Somebody let the gals know that MAGA has decided that the best solution is for the country to be poorer, and they will no longer have the lust for Disney vacations, flat screen televisions, whole house air conditioning, and new cars. And that when they are freed from these human desires, then truly they will be happier again. I'm like, do you know what the government is? And do you know what it can do and what it can't do? Obviously not, because people are going to do whatever the hell people want to do because that's what people do.
So I'm torn about this, because on the one hand, I mean, look, I mean, the thing I was, and I've written this, you know, the thing I was most depressingly wrong about with my first book, Liberal Fascism, which was the most defensible thing about it, or one of the most defensible things about it at the time I wrote it, which is that I was legitimately pissed off against the claim that the American right in the Anglo-American tradition was fascistic, like, and there's a whole intellectual history we can get into it with the Lewis brothers and all this kind of stuff about left and right and all of that. But I think circa 2008 when I was writing, or 2005 when I started writing, it was a eminently defensible claim that the history of the last 100 years, the left worked from the assumption that it had a monopoly on political virtue. And the further away you got from the left, the closer you got to all bad things, whether it was the authoritarian personality or racism or fascism or nationalism, which for a lot of people on the left were all interchangeable terms. And I sort of went through chapter and verse about how American conservatives aren't big fans of Nietzsche. They're not nihilists. They are not, you know, that they're more patriots than they are nationalists. They are the party in the Burkean sense. Not, I don't mean Republicans. I mean the faction that most cares about fidelity to the Constitution, about free markets and the rule of law and all that kind of stuff. And so long as you define your terms, you cannot say the closer you get to free markets and limited government and constitutionalism, the closer you're getting to fascism. And yet they kept calling us fascist. And the point of all that was that I believed and wrote that the right was so dogmatically committed to those things that it was just a complete misunderstanding of American politics. My monkey paw problem is that it turned out that it didn't take much for a vast swath of the American right to reject the patriotic argument, for the nationalistic argument, to reject the idea of fidelity to the Constitution, to start literally talking about military expansion of territory, which is like old school fascist kind of stuff. It's also nationalist, but that's fine, whatever. to talk about how due process is for pussies. You know, I mean, you just go down this huge list, and so on the one, the reason I bring all that up is partly my rage and contempt issues, but two, because I want to make this argument about how the left can't change for the better quickly, because, you know, if you think about Thomas Kuhn and, you know, the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, this path-breaking, paradigm-shifting book about paradigms, which James Pinkerton, is the House intellectual of the first Bush administration, could not stop writing about, to the point where Dick Darman started making fun of him, saying, "Brother, can you paradigm?" But that's neither here nor there. His whole point was that you get paradigm shifts in scientific understanding of the universe when the old consensus holders die, and then the new people become the establishment, right? I mean, that's a very shorthanded version of it. The reason why I think it's difficult for the Democrats to embrace the coalition that you're talking about, even though it's just sitting right there for them to do it, is that I'm doing this from Yale, right? We had this big panel discussion about how can universities change their fix their problems, right? The institutions that are the linchpins, are the tent poles for the Democratic Party, whether it's the groups or it's the universities or it's mainstream media, they are so beholden to a set of ideas that they have convinced themselves are right. The idea of, it's the problem with the abundance Dem thing to a certain extent, the idea of embracing an entirely new paradigm, which would render, you know, like if your entire business model is talking about how race is the most important factor in every aspect of life, and then you get a Democratic Party that says race isn't that important, that person has no choice but to say, I'm against this, because it might as well be saying you're getting rid of my sugar subsidies. And then you talk about this thing I just ranted about with the Republican Party, which abandoned all of its dogmatic positions almost overnight. And so maybe the Democratic Party can do that, and it will just take another forceful Democratic politician personality.
Look at the numbers, the same numbers about young men. So it's not really, the Republicans are really into this thing about Black and Hispanic voters, and we're doing that. It is more that young men moved, all young men. Race is a lot less important in political ideation or identification than we tend to think that it is, right? The difference between, if race is the only difference, if educational attainment, income, household status, and everything else is controlled for, yes, Black voters have been different for the reason we talked about with Lyndon Johnson, but race is not determinative, right? A Korean American 25-year-old guy who is similarly situated to a white dude someplace else, his Koreanness does not make him politically different. So what happened was young men moved right. We see the same number in religious affiliation, right? So if you look at, and I know this because I was just getting it ready because we're going to talk about it. Oh, you know, all I do on my Sunday show is just rip you off. All the Sunday show is just ripping you off. Like I have Thomas Chatterton Williams on, and then I turn on the Remnant. There's Thomas Chatterton Williams, and we're having Yoni Applebaum on.
Oh, excellent.
And
it's a good book, I have to say. It's a good book.
It's a really good book. He's a really good storyteller, and he talks about his family and all that. So it was very interesting. So the church goingness and religious affiliation of Americans, which I was digging into, you see by decade of birth, huge drops, 10-point drops between cohorts. So we go from silent generation to baby boomers to Gen X, bang, 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 10-point drops by decade. And then it levels off. So there's no difference in religious affiliation or Christian identification for Americans in the, I guess we call them young millennials and zennials. No different. The drop off stopped. Maybe that's because it hit bottom and it can't really go any lower. Or maybe it's part of the same other narrative, which is young people particularly young men, had enough. They had enough of the wild social experimentation of the left. They had enough. And COVID and everything else, they had enough. And so the backlash is on. And the backlash includes going back to church. The backlash includes voting Republican. The backlash goes on. My premise is that the best part about our political system, one of the best parts about our political system, is that politicians go where the voters are. That's where they go. For universities that want to attract the best students, if the students don't want to go places, look at the exodus of all of these kids from elite prep schools in the Northeast who want to go to like Auburn. What is going on? Well, they don't want more of the same. They wanted something different. The market effects in institutions and the market effects in politics, if it is true that there is a backlash going on, and I think there's decent evidence that there's a backlash going on in the under 30 adults, if that's true, or the under 35 adults, if that's true, then as Democrats look for how to win, they will say, how do we get these voters? We need these voters. Not how do we get them back? How do we get them? How do we get them in the first place? And the answer is, we got to give them what they want. And they don't want, the genius of Bill Clinton was that he could talk out of one side of his mouth to liberal, progressive. He knew the language, right? Having gone to Yale and done all the things and learned the vocabulary of the progressive elite. He could do that, but he never lost the ability to be a Bubba, and he could play it up, and he could talk about having a El Camino with AstroTurf in the bed, and for what, and he could, as the overused phrase now, he could code switch. And he was able to tell those voters, all right, guys, trust me, I'm a dirtbag. You can trust me that I'm not going to try to reprogram you. I'm like you. I get you. So could that be John Fetterman? Right? Is that a guy who Democrats could put forward that those voters would like? Maybe. Then the question is, will the rest of the Republicans' fealty to Donald Trump grew out of a belief. Ross Douthat wrote a piece about Donald Trump as Napoleon, this man of destiny. He survived the assassination attempt, and now he will go on to cut his path through history. Maybe it's a good one, maybe it's not a good one. And I was skeptical of it at the time. But Ross was right that that's how Republicans came to see Donald Trump, right? They knock him down, they book him, they arrest him, they do everything. He's unstoppable. He's this unstoppable person. And so this fervent religious cult has grown up around Donald Trump. But I would just remind Democrats, it's not a very big cult. It's a cult for sure, but it's not a very big cult. And the young men who chose Donald Trump over Kamala Harris, not enough to cost her the election, but certainly a big factor in how she lost. They don't worship Donald Trump, right? They're not the congressman who has the resolution to repeal the 22nd Amendment so Donald Trump can remain president for life. That's not where those guys are. Those guys they were acting against something more than they were acting for something. Now now Democrats have to find a way to say to those folks, we heard you. We're sorry. We're not going to go back to that. We're not going back.
We can keep going. I have more to discuss, including, more stuff about marmots, but I got to go catch a train back to DC. You got to go do your fancy pants wearing TV gigs. So should we probably call it there.
Can I ask you one thing?
Absolutely.
The White Lotus. Where are you on the White Lotus? What is your position?
So I stopped watching after the first season.
Okay.
I've watched none of the second season and none of the third season because I will say this. I might return to it at some point and watch it alone. I do not like watching stuff about unlikable people with sexual dysfunctions and pathologies with my wife. It is just not something. I mean, I dislike it even more with my daughter, but that wasn't an option. But I just, to me, there's some funny stuff in the first season of White Lotus, but to me, it is the high end version of The Office in a certain way, where it's just constantly trying to make you feel uncomfortable to feel fremdschämen, to feel embarrassed for these people. And I squirm with that stuff more than most people. And so I don't have the time for it. I apologize. Where are you?
I am we have one episode left in the most recent season. I watched none of the first two for all of the reasons that you described, that I wasn't interested in it. But in my case, my betrothed and I could find that as something we could watch together, because for me, it is like a crime. I watch a lot of police procedural crime kind of stuff. That's my default position for entertainment. So it has enough of that for me, but for her, it has drama. It has the interpersonal drama between the characters and the romantic tensions and all of that stuff that I think she enjoys. So it became a compromise place for me. And also for me, I think Walton Goggins is just great.
I agree with that.
He kept me in Justified the whole way through. He's just great. I find him wonderful and hilarious and great in everything. So I just wanted someone who was actually a cultural critic to tell me how to feel about this. And now I know to feel worse about
it. Did you watch him in what was that? The post-apocalyptic Fallout. Did you watch him in that?
Yeah. Too much for me. That one's too much for me.
That's so much more in my wheelhouse.
It's too much for me. And similarly, I could not watch him in The Righteous Gemstones because the shows that sneer at Christianity turn out for Christians to be kind of a bummer. It's kind of a bummer.
Yeah. Fair. Are you a Reacher fan?
No, but I've heard on your other podcast, I've heard you discuss it, and I'm tempted, because when you and Pod agree about something, then I'm like, okay, now I need to look. Now I have to look.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Pod.
Yeah, and if all three of us really like something, then you definitely should check it out. Did you ever see Banshee?
No.
Okay, so Banshee is ridiculous. I think it was on Stars or Cinemax, one of those kinds of things. And the guy who plays Homelander from The Boys is the main character in it. And watching that show, the 12-year-old Jonah Goldberg climbed the top of a mountain and spun around as a drone shot showed me looking up at the heavens with gratitude. Because for the inner 12-year-old in me, the utterly gratuitous sex and violence, really well placed, and
there you go.
The fact that the main villain guy is an Amish crime lord happens all the time, and apparently
now I know what I'm watching next.
There are hundreds of thousands of neo-Nazi foot soldiers in Western Pennsylvania that are extremely well organized. And anyway, it's a ridiculous show, but it just scratches a lot of itches. Reacher does that in a more cerebral way. It's sort of a little, Kung Fu was a Caine walks the earth, you may
leave the dojo when you can seize the Snickers from my hand.
A little bit The Fugitive, and a little bit John Wick. And so I loved Poker Face,
which is the same kind of like Incredible Hulk. We have our adventure here in this town, and then I must go on from here. Which is
my only problem with Poker Face. Is that I don't like the formula of knowing the murder up front. Like it's kind of cool once in a while, but knowing it every single time, it's a little bit like Elsbeth on CBS,
which I enjoy.
Yeah, which I enjoy too. And what I like most about that is clearly whoever's writing that show just hates young people. Yeah, it's just every now and then just twisting the knife on millennials or Gen Z or whatever.
Linear TV is saying to its audience, "We're here for you. We agree with you. We agree."
They're doing what the Democratic Party should do. Is like
that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
All right, my friend. I do have to get to a train.
All right, be well.
As always, lovely to talk to you. And for people who say I never talk about the Democrats on here, you got a lot of Democrat talk.
There you go.
There you go.